Hello, everybody. Welcome to the Global Food Systems Podcast, brought to you by Kansas State University's Office of Research Development. I'm Jay Weeks. As always, we have my co-host, Scott Tanona from the Department of Philosophy.
Hey there.
Today, we have Dr. Marty Draper, Interim Associate Dean of Research and Graduate Studies, Associate Director of K-State Research and Extension, and Department Head of the Department of Plant Pathology here today to speak with us about the kind of work that the plant pathologists do and why it's important. Marty has an impressive career past, including he was the director of the Plant Pest Diagnostic Lab and Seed Health Testing Lab at North Dakota State University, Extension Plant Pathologist from South Dakota State University. He was the National Program Leader for Plant Pathology and Integrated Pest Management at the National Institute of Food and Agriculture in Washington, D.C. for 10 years before coming to K-State in 2016 to serve as the department head of the plant pathology.
Yeah, so what do? I try and make sure that all the wheels stay on the bus for the most part, but it's been kind of a long journey to get to where I am, from being a city kid in the Omaha, Nebraska urban area and finding my way into agriculture where I really felt like I belonged.
Sure. So what is plant pathology in your opinion?
Sure. So plant pathology is really about the study of the diseases of plants. So we like to think of ourselves as plant doctors. Folks might be surprised to realize that the same organisms that cause diseases in animals and humans can cause diseases in plants. Not the same specific organisms, but bacteria, fungi, viruses. Each of those groups of organisms has pathogens that can attack various plants. And probably the best example that people are familiar with of a plant disease crisis was the Irish potato famine. And now, granted, that was more than just the disease because there was politics that came into play. But I think when we're looking at food systems, politics and policy are also drivers in how society responds to whatever that crisis is biologically.
Sure, yeah. I mean, I think the politics definitely was going to play a huge role in a lot of this. For those of the listeners who aren't too familiar with the Irish potato famine, what exactly happened?
So this was about 1845 to 1847. During that period of time, the population of Ireland decreased by about half due to emigrations and death from hunger. To this point, the population of Ireland has not rebounded to where it was in 1845.
Wow, that's incredible. So what was it that caused that? Let's do the biology first.
Sure. So there's a fungus-like organism called Phytophthora infestans that's native to South America, and that's where potato is native to. So potato had found its way to Europe, and eventually the pathogen found its way to Europe on potatoes. Mm-hmm. It's an obligate organism that you really have to have in the potato itself to survive. Ireland has just about the ideal environment for this disease to develop. And where you think about where potato late blight occurs in South America and Central America, it's really in the highlands where potato is or the centers of origin are of potato in Peru and in Bolivia and into the highlands of southern Mexico. So it was just a very favorable situation, and the practices that particularly the serfs of the time were carrying out. They would just pile potatoes, and it was a cheap source of food. A man might live on 8 pounds of potatoes a day. If they were rotting, they didn't get thrown away. They might just get tossed into a pile. And when those rotting potatoes are in a pile, they sporulate. The spores blow out, infect more. And clearly it was a crisis. Most of those peasant population didn't have really even much for sources of protein. So they might have one pig or one cow, and those were kind of treats, and you wanted to raise that cow until you could optimize it, and you'd sell part of it, and you'd save part of it as much as you could.
So I want to ask about the pathology point of view, sort of from the work that you do and the work that a plant pathologist would do. You said sort of the doctors. So would you be paying attention mostly to what's going on in the potato and the organism, or how much do you think about the systems of how potatoes are treated and stored and kept and that kind of thing?
Well, the answer to that's really all of the above.
Good.
So as a pathologist, far too often we see things at the end. We wind up being asked to do kind of the postmortem on it. But we would much rather be there forecasting when the risk is occurring and helping people address the problem before it becomes an economic issue. When you go clear back to 1845, that was the infancy of plant pathology. It was through that disease that we actually understood the nature of infectious disease. So we can talk about what Pasteur did, but it was really Anton de Berry that first proved the germ theory of disease, and it was on plants.
Right. So this is important for everybody to get a perspective here. It was not that long ago, right, that we didn't understand infectious disease, right?
Absolutely correct.
Yeah.
So if the late blight that caused the Irish potato famine occurred in Peru where it was originated, why weren't they having such major issues there like they had in Ireland?
Well, they did. I mean, there were instances of failed crops there as well, but there also is much more diversity. And so you're dealing with species of potato instead of varieties of one species of potato. And so we had a very narrow genetic base in Europe. But it's very interesting when you're in South America and looking at the things that they call potato. They're purple and they're red and the flesh is different colors and the skins are different colors and they're mottled and they're tiny and they're big and they're knobby and they're smooth, and it's every possible variation that you could think of on those tubers. And the other thing about the indigenous populations in South America is they became very adapted to whatever was happening to the potatoes. So there's another disease called soft rot that we would ordinarily throw the potato away if it had soft rot. They'd turn it into chuño, just a preserved form of potato, sort of. It's not pleasant to eat as far as I'm concerned.
Is it like pickled or what?
No, it's a little bit like chalk as far as I'm concerned. So
sounds great.
It's kind of like a freeze dried potato.
Okay.
An acquired taste.
Yeah.
So does that help with storage then, or so it doesn't?
Once it's gone through that
taken care of,
process, what's left is pretty stable.
Gotcha. So could you say something more about the lack of genetic variation, sort of how important that is to basically now controlling for problems like this?
Well, I think every instance that we have looked at through history where there's been a major disease outbreak, it's been because of narrow genetic base. And so when we think about looking at our current crop production practices where you have fields and fields and fields that are very similar, there is a vulnerability there unless we can know what the genetic properties, the traits are in those crops. So another example was in the early 1970s. There was a disease called northern corn leaf blight. And the susceptibility was carried along because of a male sterile gene. We saw northern corn leaf blight from the Florida Panhandle moving all the way up into the Midwest. And where I grew up in Iowa, there were substantial losses.
So is the benefit of the diversity mostly just that, hey, look, if you have a wider diversity of plants, fewer of them are going to be hit with this particular disease? Or is it also that because fewer of them are being hit in a particular area, you're going to see less spreading?
Yes. It's both of those things. Yeah. So it's both the susceptibility and the inoculum potential, what we call the inoculum potential. How many spores are being produced on susceptible plants? And in fact, we have a situation that's developing right now in western Kansas where we have a concern of an expanding vulnerability in our wheat crop where we have susceptibility to wheat stem rust, which has traditionally been one of the most damaging diseases worldwide, where we have about 30% of the acreage in the western portion of Kansas that is susceptible to the currently prevalent race of stem rust, the stem rust pathogen, the fungus that causes it. And so you've got a narrow genetic base on the pathogen side and you've got a narrow genetic base on the host side. We're just waiting for the environment to come together in order to have a crisis situation develop.
So there's the phrase monoculture, right, that people use for this, for convenience, right, that it makes sense to plant a bunch of the same variety, right? You know how, I mean, maybe you could speak to a little bit sort of what the advantages of that are. And then you're talking about from the pathology side of diseases, what the disadvantages are. And sort of, I'm interested maybe on your perspective of like how we got here, right? And whether we're just ready for a change now or we should have been doing something differently all along.
Well, I think, first of all, the thing to bear in mind is that the most cost-effective and efficient way of managing disease is through host resistance. So where we know that we have resistance and we can bring it into a crop, we want that to be there. And we want it to be effective against the prevalent genetics in the pathogen that's out there. Some pathogens are more general in their attack of the crop than others. How did we get there? Well, it's really good to have a crop that matures at the same time, matures evenly. The quality is uniform, and you can expect what you're going to get out of the field. Markets drive some of that. We want a certain protein content. We don't want sprouting. Various traits and qualities that are going to come into play that are going to influence what a producer is going to want to plant because they want to be able to be sure that they're going to get a profit out of the deal.
One of the things that when you say, hey, look, one of the issues here is with how the lack of diversity that we have, right? Sort of that a crop like here in Kansas, sort of we've got a pretty narrow genetic range, right? Sort of, and we're open to potential problems, right? Sort of, I can imagine resistance back to this, right? Sort of that it sounds like you're saying we've been doing something wrong, right? Or that we've got, right, that your practice should have been different. This starts to get us a little bit into the culture and politics, right? Right, and I'd rather you tell me how to fix this and let me keep on doing this thing than tell me I have to do something totally different.
Well, lots of concerns drive decisions, right? So I have one problem. I'm going to address that problem. That may expose me to another problem. Maybe I don't expect that I'm going to see that problem. I have made a risk decision, and I'm going to say that I am less averse to that risk than I am to this other risk. And we make decisions like that every day, even when we cross the street.
Sure.
So some of those things are just
we're not always paying attention to them, right? So
right,
yeah.
Right. Sometimes those things are really just part of our normal course of the day. And when we pay more attention to the decision, we maybe have a better opportunity to be responsive to it and be preventative. But genetics is not the only way that you can address a problem. So there may be tillage practices, cultural practices that you bring into play. We may use chemical fungicides to help manage as a stopgap. Sometimes we'll use those as a preventative. Sometimes we'll use those as a rescue treatment. They're never going to work as well as a rescue as they are in a preventative situation. But they become economic decisions too. So when you look at starting the season with a crop and you've got a budget for that crop, I have not factored in this additional cost. It's hard to then plug it in at the end. I have factored it in. I don't need to use it. I'm not going to use it. I just increased my profit margin. So planning and being comprehensive in that planning is really important.
How much as a scientist do you, and from the plant pathology point of view, do you really want to be recommending to people, say, hey, look, there's trade-offs, right? Sort of, and you do one thing, you take a risk on one side, you do something else, so you're taking a different kind of risk, right? And sort of from one perspective, then from a farmer's point of view, it's what they have to decide is what risks are they willing to take, right? And what do they want to do and how do they want to plan? So from the scientist's point of view, you might be just sort of giving them information to help them plan. How much do you think it's the job then from like your side to help actually move along a certain kind of policy?
A certain kind of policy
or practice? Well,
so we do try and guide practices every year. So our extension specialists are frequently putting out information about we're seeing this disease developing. These are susceptible varieties. This is a response you might take as a stopgap. In my previous time as the extension plant pathologist in South Dakota, I was on a weekly scouting tour of the state trying to keep track of where things were at. I was always reading the newsletters from adjacent states to see where their risks were because they were informing me on what I might expect in 7 to 10 days. I spent some time in the diagnostic lab in North Dakota, and I would read the newsletters from South Dakota, Nebraska, and Kansas because I had, in the time I was there, I could kind of figure out how long it was going to take from when it would get to here to when I would see it in the next state, and then I could come up with a pretty efficient prediction on when I was going to start seeing it in our diagnostic lab.
So what are some of the ways in which it moves from state to state? Is it something we can prevent, or is it solely based on things like the weather?
Yeah, so it depends on the pathogen that you're talking about. And some of them are windborne. So when we talk about the rusts, when we talk about late blight, they're both windborne, but the distance that they can travel is dramatically different. So late blight spores are very light colored. They're very susceptible to ultraviolet light. And so they're really viable for maybe a couple of miles on a cloudy day. On a sunny day, they just aren't very viable at all. Rust spores are darkly pigmented. They're protected. They're melanized, protected from UV light, and they can travel a long distance. Hundreds of miles,
cross continents, sort of kind of thing.
Yeah. So one of the favorite stories I spent some time working on soybean rust when it was introduced, when it started making its way across the world, and it was in southern Africa, and then all of a sudden, it showed up in South America. It had blown across the Atlantic Ocean.
That's wild.
And so as we were looking at it in Brazil and Argentina and Paraguay, trying to understand, okay, what might this thing look like if it makes it to North America? While we were working on it in the roughly 2002 to 2005 range, we're watching it work its way north. And we said, oh, well, when it gets to the equator, it's going to hit the doldrums. It's not going to be able to find its way across. It found its way across. We said there's no soybeans there, so there's not really going to be a great threat. We found that it was actually very, very efficient on dry beans in Colombia. And then Hurricane Ivan came and brought it across the Caribbean. And so sometimes these things can move very quickly, and a lot of it has to do with the viability of the pathogen as well as its biology.
Well, some of the effects that we see of climate change with increased storm intensity and things like that, will that have any impact on how quickly these spread?
Well, I think we could see some of these diseases driven by some of the severe storms, for sure. Hurricanes in particular. What we saw with Hurricane Ivan and soybean rust, the southern corn leaf blight, there were storms that were involved in moving that along. You're dealing with prevailing wind patterns, but when you see that there was something that came from Florida, worked its way into Arkansas, and then came up into Iowa and Illinois, that is not a prevailing wind pattern. So there are other drivers behind it that are getting it to where it's going. And a lot of it has to do with where the susceptible plant material is, too.
Yeah, is there increased risk in areas if the temperature is changing that you don't have native plants that are already going to be resistant to the things that might be coming in? Is that a sort of increasing challenge?
It is very interesting when you look at the USDA ARS plant hardiness map. We have actually seen that those hardiness zones have moved 1 to 2 zones to the north already. And we are seeing an association of pests moving along with it. So something that may have only been fit in South Florida is now moving up into Georgia and South Carolina and Alabama. So when we've seen introductions of pests, and sometimes we don't know why they came here, we don't know how they came here, and sometimes there's a complexity in the disease cycle. I think about something like laurel wilt that's affecting red bay in the Atlantic coast along Florida and Georgia and up into the Carolinas. People used to look at red bay and they'd say, what is it? It's just a little tree. It's a scrubby tree. Well, it was the predominant understory tree in the coastal areas. When it died out, there was nothing breaking the wind, and all of a sudden the big pines were getting blown over.
Okay.
But it's a wilt disease that's a lot like Dutch elm disease, and it's vectored by a little teeny tiny beetle. And we don't know if it came in on wood that was imported probably into Savannah, or if it came in with beetles that were in something. All we know is that red bay was really susceptible. And so now that has moved clear up into Maryland. It's moved across the Gulf Coast. And one of the great concerns is that avocado is susceptible. So fortunately, the Florida avocado industry is not huge, but those are the low-fat avocados that are kind of promoted as a healthier avocado.
Okay.
The Hass avocados, it hasn't moved into any areas where those are produced yet, but there is a danger, and the folks in California are really concerned about it, but not only for avocado production, but because they also have laurel species that grow along the coast and are really important in stabilizing the coastline. So there's food concerns along with these disease epidemics. There's also natural resource concerns.
Yeah, so could you follow up on that? Sort of, how do you make that distinction, a natural resource versus the food?
So, for example, I was talking about the stabilization of the shoreline, some of these plant species that we don't really think about very much.
Do you worry about like timber and things like this too?
Oh, sure. Yeah. Timber, there are huge issues with diseases in timber. White pine blister rust has minimized the 5-needle pine industry, particularly around the Great Lakes. Some absolutely intriguing diseases. When I was in North Dakota, we actually had a first report of white pine blister rust showing up in North Dakota, and it was in the Bismarck area, right smack in the middle of the state. And you're thinking, okay, how did it get here? There aren't trees for miles that would be tens of hundreds of miles that would have been susceptible. I don't know how it blew in. One tree, 30, 40-year-old tree. The very interesting thing was that's kind of a midpoint between two genetic populations. So we were really concerned that if we saw it show up there, what it would actually be genetically. And so we spent quite a bit of time after that tracking to determine whether or not we were going to see anything more. Not much eastern white pine there, but a lot of limber pine. And so limber pine is another 5-needle pine that's susceptible to the disease.
So when you come across something like that, what's the course of action? Is there a generic route that you take? You've identified something, and then there's steps to take in place to try to minimize its impact, or what do you do?
So it really depends on what the biology of the disease is. So in the case of white pine blister rust that I just used, eradication is the first thing we're going to do. We're just going to get rid of it, and then we'll monitor and make sure that it's been isolated. And in fact, that worked beautifully there. Had no problems after that. Never saw anything more. In the case of a new introduced pathogen, so let's talk about soybean rust. USDA APHIS, the Animal and Plant Health Inspection Service, the Plant Protection and Quarantine Division of that agency, is responsible for dealing with new plant introduction or new pathogen introductions, new pest introductions. The first thing they thought was, we're gonna eradicate this. And so they started a delimiting survey from where the first location was found in Baton Rouge, Louisiana, and they found that it was in, I believe, 5 states, and it was blowing all over the place. And they finally said, okay, we're moving to management. And fortunately, we knew how to manage the disease. Sometimes we don't, but in that particular case, we'd been preparing. We knew what the effective fungicides were. We knew how to try and stay ahead of it. And this is a case where it had to have something to survive on through the winter, and it was only going to survive on the Gulf Coast on kudzu. And if the kudzu froze back in a winter, you knocked the population way down, and you really delayed when the epidemics were happening in the spring. But if it was a mild winter, we saw a couple of years where soybean rust actually made its way up into Iowa by August. And so those were years when there was the potential for losses, but we were also watching for it very carefully, and producers got good warning to be able to go and spray fungicides if they felt that was a necessary thing for them to do.
So you made the comparison of plant pathology to medicine, to human medicine before, right? And most of the time anyway, we're lucky enough not to have to worry about sort of major diseases coming in, sweeping in, sort of wiping off, a good chunk of the population like the potato blight did, right, to the potatoes, right? Of course, epidemiologists sort of do worry about the tracking of disease, and there are some of them that we can be really worried about, and in other parts of the world, sort of it's more of a concern, right?
The corollary I would draw with the late blight situation in Ireland would be the Spanish flu in 1918.
Right. So like what are the differences you see between sort of the plant pathologist's job, right, and somebody working to control infectious disease in humans?
Well, I think the biggest difference is people's value of what the damage is. I mean, I'm much more concerned that my family got sick than the tree in the front yard got sick.
Sure.
And so the response tends to be much slower when you're dealing with something on a plant. I think that people that are looking at those plants for their livelihood may respond differently. But when you're looking at an elm tree, an American elm tree in your front yard that's wilting, you may not have the same concern about it. Although just like your flu might spread from you to your neighbor to your other family members, that tree is a source of the disease to all the other trees around it. It was when I worked in diagnostic labs over the years, we often worked with the city to do confirming tests for the presence of the pathogen. And the treatment is to eradicate, to remove a tree that is beginning to show symptoms. You can use fungicides to treat ahead of infection and use it as a prophylactic, a preventative treatment, so that you don't wind up losing that tree. But once it's infected, it's a losing battle to try and use fungicides. So I would do the testing, confirm the pathogen, and people would go out, and the city would go out or whoever and remove the tree. But quite often we would get samples in that were just stone cold, graveyard dead. And I don't know, it just died overnight. No, you apparently have missed this. This has been dead for a while. Yeah. And so, some of these things that are in our landscape are just a little bit out of sight, out of mind.
Paying attention to, right? Yeah.
We don't see them the same way until we see a pile of leaves in the yard or something like that.
Right.
Is there something we can do as scientists to impress upon people how important it is to pay more attention to these things, or is there just too many other competing interests?
I think it comes down to human values, and what I value and what you value are probably different, and what we see in the world around us are probably different, and it's where we find our quality of life. So I don't know that there's a way we can address that's going to work for everybody. I think the thing that we do try and do is raise awareness. And so there's lots of campaigns that go out there, whether it's about diseases that are new or insect pests that are new. So even right here on campus, we've got emerald ash borer signs around, and we've got some trees that are being used as trap trees. And it's very much the same thing. You just try and elevate the awareness.
So with those trap trees, can you talk a little bit about like what's going on there? If people see those, what they're doing?
I am a plant pathologist, not an entomologist.
Sure, I didn't know if you had any experience with that or not. So what are the biggest plant pathogens that we're worried about today in the United States that if they get here will cause the biggest trouble?
So I think probably I'll use wheat as an example since we're here in Kansas, but there are two diseases that we are very concerned about. I've talked about wheat stem rust. There is a new variation, a new variant, genetic variant in Africa that showed up in 1999 in Uganda, and it's referred to as UG99, wheat stem rust. Well, there's a whole family of genetics that goes along with that now, and as plant pathologists and geneticists, we look at it more generally as the T series of wheat stem rust variants. And so we have a classification scheme that we use that's letter-based, and if the code comes out and it's got a T at the start, we have a problem because we've got some the resistance that we have in our wheat varieties is not as appropriate to that series of the pathogen as it is to some others. The other one is a disease called wheat blast that developed in Brazil and has moved through central South America. We actually have a very active wheat blast research program here in the plant pathology department at K-State. And recently, that pathogen found its way into Bangladesh, and it got there probably on seed. The pathogen will infect seed. It will grow off the seed. It will lead to infections. But it wasn't actually seed that was imported. It was probably grain that was planted as seed. So it was probably low-quality seed, but there were a few years where there was a seed shortage in Bangladesh, and I think that there was an effort to get something that could be planted from wherever they could get it. And so that has become established. the pictures of producers burning fields is a striking scene. But there's a lot of concern that that disease is now going to work its way up into India and up into the wheat production areas in the north of India. So you've got that happening from the south now coming toward India. To the west, you have UG99 that's moved out of Africa from Uganda to Kenya into Afghanistan, into Iran, but not into Pakistan yet. Okay. And so we've got these two threats coming. And so when you're thinking about global food security and the importance of wheat as one of the top 4 food crops in the world, that's a breadbasket in northern India. And that's really a concern.
So are we away from the days where we could see something as bad as the potato blight, like the famine level kind of things? Are our systems, diverse enough? Is our science good enough now to prevent that kind of disaster, or could we hit something like that?
Well, I think we could, and it depends on the convergence of politics with famine. But I think depending on where you are in the world, there are threats that could cause that kind of problem, a problem of that magnitude. Mm-hmm. I would be concerned in Southeast Asia with some of the problems that can hit rice. I would be concerned in North India if some of these things come to pass on wheat. Global trade can potentially soften some of that, but mm-hmm. politics can get in the way. Mm-hmm. So it's possible. I think there are fewer excuses for it, but I think it's still possible.
So you had brought up the politics as contributing to the famine back in Ireland in the 19th century. Could you say something else? I mean, what were the factors there that made it worse?
So Robert Peel was the prime minister at the time, and there were food shipments that were sent to Ireland that he didn't allow to come to shore, did not allow to come to port. So there were shiploads of corn that were sitting off the coast of Ireland that were not allowed to come in and be used for relief. They put up soup kitchens, mm-hmm. essentially, where they were essentially making cornmeal mush and distributing that. But there was a means test. You could only get a bowl of food if you could walk to the area kitchen. Okay. So if you had family members that were very ill and couldn't walk, you had to come back and either share yours with them or they didn't get any. So there were some. It was a very harsh time.
Right. So a response to the problems that did not actually help address, right, for the people and sort of for political reasons. Do I remember something about so there were factors that also kicked a lot of the farmers off of the land there too, right? So I don't remember what. So
it was subdivision of land. So I mean, you were dealing with very small parcels of land that were trying to support people while those people were working for the big landowner. I would just say that the Irish people have endured some tremendous oppression over the years, and the breakdown of the feudal society in Ireland was a good thing. Mm.
So what are the biggest political issues then you'd be worried about for global food systems from the plant pathology point of view? Sort of, the kinds of things that I'd imagine are, right, you can see a risk coming, a big, danger, or sort of something that's like actually already happening, and sort of the political system's not responding, right, or responding in ways that are detrimental. So,
well, I think import-export issues are a real concern, and depending upon what the quarantines might be in a country and the way that those imports might be regulated, mm-hmm. Could be a concern. And we're seeing pests moving around with trade. Yeah. And so how we respond to them and how we erect our quarantine requirements can have a big impact on that. And there's the economic side of it too. I mean, if somebody's involved in that trade on both ends. Mm-hmm. So you like orange juice?
I like orange juice. Yeah.
Well, enjoy it now.
Yeah.
Because the industry's in trouble.
Why?
So I would guess that maybe within 5 years there's not going to be an orange juice industry in Florida.
Wow. That's crazy.
So we've been saying this for 15 years, 5 years from now, but it really is. It really
Predictions
is.
of doom that never come true. This is a problem.
The wheels are falling off the machine, though, and part of the situation is as you wind up killing groves and and there's more space between groves, then it slows down. The epidemic slows down. But there's a disease called citrus greening, or huanglongbing, as the Chinese name for it. It came from Asia. It's spread by the Asian citrus psyllid. This is a very difficult to detect pathogen. It was only in the last 15 years that it's actually been identified. They knew the psyllid was involved with it, but finally came up with technology that would allow them to identify it molecularly. Can't be grown in culture. It just only exists in the plant or in the insect.
How common is that?
How common?
Yeah, they can't grow it in culture.
It's not very common.
Okay.
There's
right.
a handful
really
of organisms.
On it then, right?
Yeah, there's a handful of organisms that we've known about for years that we knew that was the case, but we really didn't know exactly what they were. So, and then, I'll finish the story on oranges first here. But so when it came into Florida, it was generally what happens is the insect comes in, we find the insect, and it takes 3 to 5 years to recognize that the disease is there. Because it takes that long for the symptoms to build up in the tree, the level of the infection to build up to the point where it expresses symptoms. And then it's kind of funny because the trees start looking a little bit yellow, and so there were people in Florida that said, we just need to fertilize the trees. We'll fertilize them more, which just masked the symptoms. The disease was still there. The pathogen was still present, and it could still be moved around. What you really need to do is remove the tree. Well, nobody wanted to give up their dooryard orange tree or whatever citrus it was. And so it really moved across the state very rapidly. And as orange groves became unproductive and producers went out of business, they were simply abandoned. And they remained there as a source of the pathogen to move to other areas. It's made its way into Texas. It's made its way. The psyllid is in California, but I don't know that the pathogen has been identified there yet. So it's working its way across the country. There are 3 different strains. There's an Asian strain, a South American strain, and an African strain. We're only dealing with the Asian strain in the U.S. right now.
Is there anything that seems to be able to stop it, or any promise, any hope? There's
a lot of very new technologies that are being tested, but to this point, we really don't have a good approach. We want to identify it early and then try and manage the psyllid if it comes into new areas. Psyllid is a weird little insect.
What are some of those new technologies?
So they're looking at using RNAi, interference RNA, and they're looking at heat treatment in the roots. Very strange mechanisms that they're running across these groves, warming the soil and during the dormant period for the tree and the non-productive time for the tree. And
like how hot?
I couldn't tell you for sure. I've seen the research proposals, but I haven't seen the data off of them. Okay. So there's things that are happening all the time, and a lot of these things occur because we introduce a pathogen out of a part of the world where it's in stasis with its host into a part of the world where there's a new host genetics that it's interacting with, and everything is susceptible.
So are there opportunities for some sort of biotechnology way of providing resistance to the new to orange trees so they aren't impacted by this? Or like they did with the papaya, right? Was an example of being able to protect against that kind of stuff?
Well, papaya is a great story, but I'll get back to that later. And the answer on the orange side is I don't know. It's a different kind of organism to be dealing with. Liberibacter is a fastidious bacterium, and so it's not behaving the same way as a virus would be behaving in the plant, such as we're dealing with papaya.
For so many of us, we can be really disconnected from our food, at least so I'm a totally part-time gardener. I got a few plants, right, and sort of, I see something wrong with the tomato plants. I have no idea what to do, right, sort of because it's not my thing, right? But at least I've got that little bit of connection, right? But for so much of the rest of my food, I get to not even worry about how it's produced, right? So how much of my food should I be worried about, right? Sort of, I should be worried about orange juice. Should I be worried about bananas and coffee and all the other good stuff that I like?
You shouldn't be worried. You should be concerned.
Okay.
No, I think that we have answers. We have management. We could lose some of the crops that we really care about, or they may become expensive. Mm-hmm. So we could be looking at situations where if we're going to have oranges, we're going to be importing oranges. Mm-hmm. But frankly, this citrus greening is present in the majority of the production areas around the world. So I'm not entirely sure how we're going to get through that.
Get through that at all, yeah.
But there is work to come up with resistance. We'll eventually get there, but there will be a lag, and it will require reestablishment of the industry. So, if you can look at something like the virus resistance that you get with papaya, that was really cool.
What happened there?
So basically, you can engineer the gene that produces the coat protein of the virus into the plant, and coat protein will expression of the coat protein in the plant will create a resistance to the virus. So it's really a strange little thing, and they usually use a reverse copy of the coat protein in the transformation, but it gets into the GMO issue. And so depending upon where you are in the world and who your market is, it may or may not be an acceptable solution to that consumer.
Mm-hmm. But virtually all papayas available now are genetically modified, correct?
I thought that was true, but that's not entirely true. There are parts of the world where the technology has been rejected.
Okay. Would it be accurate to say that the solution is sort of an inherent vaccine type way of looking at it?
That's a very good way of looking at it. Yeah, it is not exactly like an immune system, but it is a defense mechanism.
Mm-hmm.
Interesting. That's fascinating. So are there any major technological advancements that you see way off in the future for plant pathology, and what might those kinds of things look like? If you were to speculate, where do you see plant pathology going?
This is when I give you the long pause while I think about it.
Well, there are just so many advances in machine learning and that sort of stuff. Do you see any applications for that? Are people talking about that for plant pathology applications?
There's some really cool things that have been talked about with indicator plants, for example, where you might have plants in the field that if they're infected by some organism, they change color, or they send off some kind of signature that you can pick up with your drone that's monitoring the crop. So I think one of the things that's exciting down the road is in the monitoring and forecasting realm, and how we're going to be able to bring in this huge body of weather data and combine that with some monitoring and tracking to determine where our risks are and how we should respond. If we can get to the point where we can say, oh, I'm subscribing to this service, I can plug in the variety that I'm growing, I can tie into the weather system, I can use this monitoring system that's out there, and maybe someday that's even satellite-based. If we can figure out the signatures, the biggest problem with that kind of technology is there's too many things that look alike. You're detecting stress. You don't necessarily know what the source of the stress is, and that's where the indicator plants are pretty cool. But you can get a recommendation then back based on what the pathogen is, what the environment is, and what your susceptibility is in your variety. So it's not just that you've got a good environment and you've got wheat stem rust blowing in. It's that you've got those two things, plus you've planted a variety that's going to be susceptible to the variant of the stem rust that's out there. So you can really optimize any treatment you might put on the field.
Using the understanding of the disease not to just be coming in at the end as a pathologist, but to fix things ahead of time.
Right.
Getting in the prevention side rather than coming in as the pathologist sort of after the fact saying what went wrong.
We would much rather be on the preventative side.
I bet the plants would rather you be there too.
And the hungry people too.
And the people, right.
Yeah.
So is that going to take some sort of collaboration both between the private sector and universities to get things like this up and off the ground? I think sometimes that the integration between the private sector and universities gets a bad rap, but it's essential for progress in these areas, right?
I think the invention from the research side and then entrepreneurialism to get it launched into some kind of package that people can use is critical. Too often we pursue research at a university from an academic standpoint, and it doesn't always get translated in a way that can actually benefit society. Sometimes we get a lag, and scientists can get very excited about what they're finding, but and depending on where we are in that research spectrum, from basic to foundational to applied to kind of a demonstration and then implementation. We've got to find where our invention fits and make sure it continues to move down the spectrum and get to the point where it actually is doing something for us. And when we're way up here on the basic research end and you're looking at some metabolic process, you have to have the right mindset to figure out how that actually influences the next step down the research spectrum. And sometimes it takes a while to figure out how you turn that on in that next system so that it actually benefits, so that it produces the right compounds in the plant that enhances the health of the individual that eats it, or that reduces the disease that you're getting, or repels an insect pest, or whatever.
So that makes me think of the following question. So you've been talking about extension at a couple of points, and talking about plant pathology is actually going out, seeing what's happening on the ground, right? But then you also talked about basic research, sort of how much of what gets done in plant pathology is the kind of basic research where, so the term means you're sitting, not thinking immediately of applications. You're not going out and sort of engaging in extension. You're not going out and helping the farmers right now. You're just trying to understand something, right?
Right.
So how much of plant pathology is on that end of the spectrum, and how much is really applied? How, maybe here at K-State and then in general, right, in terms of the field.
Well, I would say that here at K-State, our program is fairly balanced. We have applied research, we have extension, we also have some pretty basic research that's largely in the genetic and genomic realm. Phenomics, looking at the expression of these genetics. We also have some work that's done on the epidemiology, understanding the interaction of the pathogen in the environment and the host, and how those pathogens might move. So it's all those things. I mean, you can spend all your time on the producer end, the user end, but when you do that, you're in a corner because you've got no new tools coming in. So you have to have that research feeding your next step, your next phase of how you're going to address any problem.
Are there big disagreements in terms of how to strike that balance? In terms of how much, if you looked overall, how much basic research do we need to be inoculating our food systems down the line versus how much do we need to be worrying more right now about current problems?
Well, I think that where you see that in large part is in the funding environment. So funding drives a lot of what research is done.
Right. Not everybody thinks about this if you're not a scientist, if you're just sort of on the consuming end of the science, right? How much actually goes on the funding side. Yeah.
And so when you get to the funding side, what were the drivers that made the decisions on where the money was going to go to fund the next research? That's always been a challenge. So I spent 10 years in Washington, D.C. working for a funding agency, and how those decisions were influenced on how we were going to balance that money was always a challenge, because the perspective we might have on an issue might be very different than what a producer group, a commodity group might have. And their concern may be quite valid, and we'd have to try and figure out a way to balance their need versus our perceived need of the entire food system So are we channeling money toward specialty crops, or are we channeling money toward conventional row crop, field crop? And then some of that was driven by Congress. They would help us make that decision by where they said the money had to go.
Sure.
So they would create a new program that was, in the time I was there, the Specialty Crop Research Initiative, which wound up being one of the biggest grant programs that we had. And it had specific prescription on where the money was going to go, how we could use the money. So we had other programs that were that we had more influence over. Some were applied, some were basic. And when AFRI, the Agricultural Food and Research Initiative, was created in the 2008 Farm Bill, they actually said you have to have a balance between basic research and applied research. A certain percentage of the money has to go toward applied research. And I think it started out at 40%. Okay. So that really caused the funding agency to look differently at how they wrote requests for application, how they wrote grant programs, and how they defined applied versus basic.
Sure. Were there any big eye-openers at the time you spent on the funding side of things that you just did not expect to see?
Well, you never know what surprise is going to come to you from Congress. It's funny. I think federal workers get bashed a lot, but federal workers carry the mail for Congress. Mm-hmm. Congress makes the decision. Federal civil service workers make it work. Mm-hmm. And they don't always get all the information they need to make it work the best way. Again, the 2008 Farm Bill, I was managing a program that provided funds to every state to do integrated pest management and make sure that there was a presence of integrated pest management to producers at the extension level. We went into the night that the final night of conference committee on the Farm Bill, and we thought we knew where everything was. And the next day when it was passed, one word was changed from shall be distributed to shall be competed. And this bill was passed in June. The end of the fiscal year is the end of September. And now all of a sudden I had a $9 million program that I had to figure out how to get competed and distributed.
Wow.
So those are the things. And I don't think that Congress thought far ahead to recognize
what the repercussions of that were going to be, right? Yeah.
The operational problems with that.
So what are some of the operational problems? I mean, to an academic who deals with grants and things like that might make sense and why that's a problem, but what problems does that cause?
So Congress authorizes grant programs. They appropriate money to go along with those grant programs. The agencies determine what the criteria are, post an RFA, and then it goes through an approval process. And in the two administrations that I worked for, the approval process was different in both of them. I would say in both the Bush administration and the Obama administrations, there were things that were really good that they did that made it easy for the agency to do some of the things that they had to do. And there were things that they both did that made it harder. And so depending upon who the political appointees are that you're working for, that could determine how much oversight they had over what was going to be in an RFA, how long it was going to take them to approve it. And at one point in time, the RFAs passed through our agency. They went to the secretary. They went to the Office of Management and Budget. Oh, come on, we got to get this money out the door. And in the process, you're burning up so much time, then you're left with only a short time to get the actual applications in, to get them reviewed, and to get the money awarded.
It's a pretty intensive process, right?
It can be very tedious.
What are the major concerns? Do you have any major concerns about funding now, sort of either the process or the levels or what people are focusing on at the national level?
Well, I would say I have all those concerns. There's not enough money for food agricultural research. There are gaps in the research funding that make it difficult to accomplish some of the things that we really need to accomplish. And when I talk about the food and ag research spectrum, I'm really talking about everything from human nutrition to some of the basic research that's going to feed our applied research. there have been some good things that have happened, but in the process, as you start looking at more applied research and more extension being added into the program, you wind up diluting some of the other end of the research spectrum. And so there are fewer new ideas that are being fed into that end of the spectrum. But so I think the challenges are the amount of money and the gaps that we have in the kinds of research that are being supported.
What are the major things that you would like the average person in the United States to know more about food systems, or from particularly your point of view, what goes on the disease side of plants and food production?
Well, I would extend it even beyond that. I would say, first of all, universities do a lot of very valuable research to make sure that we will have a reliable supply of food. I think producers implement some of that information, sometimes not even knowing the source, the origination, because it gets picked up by private companies and implemented in their products. Food policy over the years has been one of the things that has actually changed the standard of living in the United States. And you go back to, I think it was the Nixon administration and Earl Butz as the Secretary of Agriculture that basically said, we're going to have an inexpensive food policy. That requires there to be some government supports for food, which some people don't like. But we have the lowest cost of food in the world in this country. Earl Butz used to talk about it as, I think, the 7% solution, that you would only have to spend 7% of your income on food. Well, I think that varies depending upon what your income is.
Sure.
And when you're very poor, that might still be a very high number.
Sure.
But it's a lower number in the United States than it is in Egypt or in Gabon or in Paraguay.
Right. This is really important in terms of what resources you have available, right? It's not just that you don't have to spend all your time growing your food, but it's right. So then you have the time available to do other things, right? But I mean, that's pretty remarkable when you think about it. Sort of,
right.
So this is a sort of major driver of living life, right? You need food, right? You're not going to make it, right, if you don't have food. And sort of, we get it really cheap and really easy.
And we get concerned about the cost of housing.
Yeah.
But even when food is high, food is pretty cheap in the U.S. compared to other parts of the world.
Yeah, I mean, it doesn't feel like that, I know, for a lot of people. And for sure, right, if you're lower income, it doesn't feel that way, right? But it's an interesting perspective to have.
If there are students out there that are interested in this sort of thing and want to get involved in plant path, what would you suggest as a career path for them?
Plant pathology at Kansas State is a graduate program, but we take students from a genetics background, from an agronomy background, from a horticulture background. Not very often that we have them come out of the social sciences. They wind up having some background that they wind up having to catch up on. But there are a lot of different perspectives on plant pathology, too. We have a couple of students right now that are really taking an end-use consumer extension approach in their research, working on master's degrees. We have a very extensive genetics program in our department. And anybody that has questions, I'd be happy to chat with them. Or we have a graduate program director, Megan Kennelly, that could also visit with them about where they might fit. Application time period is in the spring, but we love to hear from people any time of the year that they think they might be interested in pursuing a higher education with us.
Great, and they should look to your website for that?
The website is the place to go.
Okay, and we'll link to that in the show notes. So thank you again, Marty, for
so
your
much.
time. We appreciate it.
Sure thing.
Thanks so much. See you all soon.